to share with you is the lightning round of what I like to call how Washington really works. And this is kind of the sausage making lecture, right? This is how policy really gets made, but most people don't want to know. It's like a lot of people love to eat sausage, but they don't want to know how that came to be. So it's a similar thing. It can be an ugly process, as we've certainly seen recently. It can be a nasty process, but at the same time, there is a process. And understanding kind of how this system really works versus what you read in your government book is something that's really useful as you think about politics and policy generally. So in order to talk about how Washington really works, I, along with a wonderful mentor of mine, have come up with something we call the 5 Ps. Now, to give my mentor her due, she did the first 3 of them. In fact, she taught these to me right before I started my career on Capitol Hill, and I added the last 2. So this is a good multi-generational approach to thinking about politics and policy, elections, the issues that you care about. Anytime you want to make social change, these kinds of issues are going to come into play. So let me just go through them very quickly, and then I'm happy to answer some questions at the end. The first one, I know it seems obvious, it's politics. But it's not as obvious as you think, because it's not, when I talk about politics in this context, just simply about politics globally, all of politics. In this instance, I'm talking about the horse race. I'm talking about who's up for election, who's up for re-election, who's retiring, who's raising money, who's not raising enough money, how all that impacts not only their campaigns and their elections to get into or to stay in office, but how that horse race impacts their ability to impact policy. As you probably saw when we were talking about the country, the whole country was talking about the impeachment of President Trump a few weeks ago. There was some focus on certain Republican senators in many respects because of the politics of their particular situation. So, you know, Susan Collins right now is in the race for life to stay in Maine versus Senator Lamar Alexander, who is decided to retire and not running for re-election. How could that potentially impact their votes? Senator Mitt Romney is in a very safe seat in Utah and is not up for re-election very soon. And Joe Manchin is in a very red state as a Democrat, but a red state that supports Donald Trump, most definitely. So all these folks were thinking about the politics of their votes as much as they were thinking about whether this was the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, the constitutional thing to do, all those things. So regardless of your politics, and by that I mean whether you might be a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, the politics of a particular situation always come in play. The other thing that comes into play with politics, as I mentioned, is, as I said, elections, and so polling issues. How are things polling? How are things working? Who's popular? Who's not? You know, right now there's a lot of nervousness on behalf of the Democrats because despite being impeached but then being acquitted, President Trump is in many respects on the rise, in many respects because of the economy. How is that going to affect politics down the road? So all these things come into play when we talk about the first P. Now, when I talk about the 5 Ps, these are kind of the lenses I use to analyze any particular situation that I'm dealing with in terms of public affairs. How am I going to handle it? What do I need to know? Who are my friends? Who's going to be my oppositions? How do I prepare? So again, thinking about politics, think about the electoral piece and all that goes with that. Okay, now the second P is policy. Now, again, with policy, you may think that's very easy, but the policy piece here is really the solution. It's really the answer to whatever question you're asking. I would say any of you that are interested in politics have a particular issue that drew you in, and you love that issue, it speaks to you, and you believe that you can make the best case for it. And if it were only up to you making a great argument, everybody would get their policies passed. But in order to move any kind of legislation, the whole of the 5 Ps comes into play. So just the idea of it, you can have the most popular idea on the planet, and if the other 4 Ps don't come into alignment, it's not going to pass. So a really good example of this, I'll tell you, is when we first were working on campaign finance reform. We wanted to make sure that we tried to get more money out of politics. It was a bipartisan bill on the House side, on the Senate side, and it had enough votes to pass. It had already passed the Senate, and even though it had, I think at that point, around 225 or so co-sponsors in the House, the Speaker of the House was not bringing the bill up for a vote. Now, of course, that's the Speaker's right. The Speaker gets to decide what comes to the floor and what kinds of rules will be used to consider it. But you can do something called, you can do a procedural end around, and that gets me into the 3rd P, which is procedure, that even if you've got a great policy and you've got the votes to pass it, but you can't get someone to take it up, you can use procedure to force their hand. And that happened in this particular case, but believe it or not, it still ended up not working because they were able to continue to massage procedure to make sure that campaign finance reform, at least in that iteration, didn't pass. We saw really skillful use of procedure, again, during the impeachment trial, in terms of House Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who is brilliant at procedure, was using votes and the kind of order of things, whether they'd have witnesses or not, all of those things came into play. And he was able to use the procedures of the Senate to make that trial go the way he wanted to. Regardless of how you feel about that trial, the reality is, in terms of the rules that he set out, he followed them. And that was all he was worried about. So you can make procedure be your friend or be your enemy, depending. So again, with the 5 Ps, again, we just did the first 3 now: politics, thinking about the elections; policy, thinking about the issues; procedure, thinking about literally, how am I gonna pass this? Do I need a law? Do I need a regulation? How am I gonna make that work? All those things are like the backbone. That's the nuts and bolts, the bread and butter, all the things I can think of. But the next 2 really have a huge impact, particularly in a 21st century dynamic where we have social media and 24-hour news and really the kind of pundit celebrities that we'll see. You know, a good example of this was, I think the NBA just had its All-Star game. And former Secretary of Education Arnold Duncan played in like the Pro-Am, the celebrity game, and people were like, he was the Secretary of Education. How is he possibly a personality or a celebrity? But he was, because he worked with Barack Obama. He was known for playing basketball with Barack Obama. And oh, by the way, he's a great basketball player. He played professionally in Australia before he ended up back here and becoming a teacher. So don't undercount the importance of personality to how partisan politics works. So these last 2, personality and press, as you can imagine, go hand in hand. You know, one of the sayings out there when it comes especially to presidents, that people don't necessarily vote for the person that they think is going to be best for them on policy issues, that they almost instinctively vote for the person that they most want to have a beer with. Who do they think is interesting? Who do they like? Who seems like they'd be a good conversation over a cup of coffee. So it's one of the reasons why, and as young women, probably something you all have noticed, when they talk about the women candidates, they keep talking about this likability stuff. Do people like her? Is she likable? What's the problem? course, they don't worry about likability with men, but for women who are running, this personality factor really comes into play. Now, I would also tell you that this can also be a situation where you might have some either strange alliances or some rivalries that come up that also exhibit and show people's personality. And I certainly think our current president has one of the most interesting personalities to ever occupy the Oval Office. Again, whether you like him or not. You know, the fact that he came zooming into that NASCAR race over the weekend in Air Force One was just a fascinating piece of, quite frankly, reality television. And obviously their personality is going to be an issue. Now, the last P, as I mentioned, is press. This is media. This is journalism. This is social media. This is who's getting the big interviews, who has a lot of followers, are they raising money online? All of the things that you can think of with media and the hits that both what we call earned media and free and paid media comes into play. Paid media is when they buy an advertisement, right? I mean, Mike Bloomberg is buying advertisements all over. He's paying a lot of money for that. And I encourage you, if you've not seen any of them, to look at them, because he's taking an interesting tact in that he's skipping the first 4 elections of the primary season, and he's just going to come on board for Super Tuesday. And he's doing that by virtue of the fact that he is, in fact, ruling the airways with paid media and with advertisements that he brought in psychologists to work on. Psychologists who specialized in narcissistic behavior issues, as well as professional comedian writers, to come up with just the kind of ads that they think are going to bug Donald Trump the most. I got to tell you, just on that alone, you can already see that this election, that 2020, is going to be a roller coaster. But the other part of press is the earned media. Who do people like? Who gets the interviews? Who gets followed around? The earned media is the stuff that you get for free because you said something pressworthy, you did some kind of a cool event. People want to know what's happening with you. And this is, of course, also where social media comes into play as well. Okay, so we have the 5 Ps. When we talk about how Washington really works, when you think about a particular issue that you want to move forward on, you need to think about these 5 Ps. The politics of the situation, the policy involved, the procedure, what is it going to take to pass it, the personalities involved, who's going to be in favor of it, who's your opposition, is there a celebrity that loves your issue that could come out front and really speak to it for you in a way that's helpful. You know, we've seen Patricia Arquette really come out in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment, and certainly her personality and celebrity has been useful there. And then, of course, the press. Who gets covered? Who gets the actual media time? Who has enough money to buy the advertisements that are necessary to pass legislation or elect a candidate? One last thing with the press that I'll tell you that is really interesting about this race is that Mike Bloomberg and Tom Steyer are buying up so much of the TV time that even though someone like Amy Klobuchar is really kind of forging ahead, now that she's got some money, there still might not be any time for her to buy because they've already picked it up. So having that early money is huge because they literally have squeezed her out of the television race. The other thing there is that apparently with Mike Bloomberg's race, they are hiring people at really good salaries, right down to the greenest field organizer. And because they're hiring people for all the Super Tuesday elections, apparently, again, some of these other campaigns that had not made it to Nevada or South Carolina or Ohio or Michigan yet, they're having a hard time finding staff because Bloomberg has sucked them all up. So it's just a fascinating dynamic going on in this particular race, and the 5 Ps have absolutely been on display for all of us to see. So let me stop there because, as I said, I want you to be able to ask questions. And the reality is, if I've done anything for you today, I just want you to think about what's going on behind the curtain. And it's the 5 Ps that's going on behind the curtain that really will determine the winner in either an election or any kind of voting situation, ballot initiative, so on and so forth. Okay, I hope that was helpful.
All right. Thank you, Lisa, for all of your information and wisdom there. We'll take a couple of minutes for questions, but I actually have one to start us off. You can write your questions in the chat box. But I actually have a question. So I noticed that there's no necessarily logistical order to this, but is there a particular P that maybe wins out in the long run? They're all important, but is there one that is the most important?
Yeah, and you know what? People are going to be bummed when they hear this, but it's procedure. It's absolutely procedure. I know you'd love to think that it's policy, that the best idea is going to win, or that the best candidate's going to win in when it comes to politics. But again, I give the example of what just happened in terms of the presidential impeachment. It was procedure all the way, that the House Dems used to their advantage as they were impeaching the president, and the Senate Republicans used to their advantage as they were acquitting the president. And that was all about knowing how the system works, parliamentary procedure, and making it work for them. So yeah, someone who knows procedure is worth their weight in gold. And if you happen to watch some of the trial in particular, it was almost like watching like a sports event, because people, you know, the pundits on TV were noticing who was talking to who and what was going on the floor. And one person that Senator Claire McCaskill kept pointing out, actually 2 people, were the Senate floor leads for both the Dems and the Republicans, because whenever they were confabbing, you know a deal was being made, and it was all about procedure.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, anybody else have any questions? You can either write them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself as well. I have another one if we can, if we'll go from there. Do you mind sharing one thing maybe that either young women or young women professionals could do to maybe exercise or execute some sort of influence, like right now, either within Washington or within their own cities, or, I mean, probably we'll stick to Washington, but yeah, to execute some sort of influence in their own power?
I tell you what, number one, registering to vote, because young women in particular are not registered to vote to the levels that they should be. Number 2, taking people to the polls with you. So don't just make sure you're registered to vote, make sure your friends, your family, the neighbor, the dog catcher, the guy who delivers your newspaper, make sure they're all registered to vote. And be very clear with them that just because they think they're registered doesn't mean they are. There are a lot of states out there right now that are purging voters. So if they didn't vote in 2018, they may have been purged from the list. They're not notified. They'll just show up on election day 2020 and suddenly be told that they're not allowed to vote. So there are sites that you can go on to online where you can check your registration. You can call your Board of Elections directly, double check that you're registered. Don't take that for granted, because there are going to be a lot of people in this election turned away from the polls who thought they were registered, and it turns out they're not. So to have an impact, to really make a difference, people got to get to the polls and speak their minds, but they're not going to be able to speak their minds if they haven't registered, and if they haven't continued to protect that registration throughout the year to make sure that it's stuck, that it wasn't one of the ones that was culled out. Unfortunately, a lot of folks are being removed, legally or not, from the election rolls, and they're not being notified.
Thank you again.
Oh, and I would, you know, the other thing I would say there is that college students in particular are a target for this. Anything they can do, particularly if you're trying to vote where your college is instead of where your parents live, There's a lot of folks who don't like that. You have every right to vote where you're living. You spend most of the time in your college town. But you've got to make sure that your registration is legit and that you constantly check to make sure that it has not been wiped out, because unfortunately, college students are a target. College students, young people, and people of color.
Yeah, that is good to know. Thank you. And I'm a more recent graduate myself, so that is also good to know for my sake as well. Anybody have any other questions for Lisa before we go, or before I conclude? All right. Lisa, do you have anything else you want to share? Maybe anything that you didn't get to say?
You know, I think the last thing that I would put in there is, again, to have impact, volunteer. If you want to see how this really works, go volunteer for a campaign, knock on some doors, stuff some envelopes, answer some calls, you know, send some text messages, go do a couple of days at least of campaign work. It will open your eyes to how this process really moves.
Do you have a favorite campaign story?
You know what? My favorite campaign story is a sad story, because I was one of those college students where my voter registration was wiped out. I had campaigned for a candidate when I was in college, and I went to vote, and I was still living in the same residence hall, but I had changed rooms, and they decided, because I changed room, even though the physical address was the same, that I was not allowed to vote. And that has always stuck with me, because it didn't have to be that way. That was a very specific targeting to make sure that a young person they didn't consider to be a legit voter got to participate in the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and especially too, if you have a lot of young voters saying, like, I don't do politics, I don't do policy, I don't do procedure. Yeah,
I do it every day. They're all lobbyists. That's the thing. We lobby each other all the time. We lobby each other about where we're going to go to dinner, what movie we're going to see, who's going to clean the kitchen this week. We lobby each other all the time. It's just another form of persuasive communication.
That's great. Well, thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate you taking the time.